Hello, am I live? Can a producer talk to me and tell me that I'm live?
You're live.
You're live.
Okay. Well, I'm in the parlor of writer friends of mine, Joe Formicella and Suzanne Hudson, where I sit from time to time talking about books. And there might be ambient noises that Joe and Suzanne make. And my dog Bobby is at my feet. He might say something, I don't know, but just forgive all that. Otherwise, we'll proceed here with this. I saw the screen said remembering William Gay. If you've ever read William Gay, you won't. Nobody can forget him. He was a friend of mine, and the one thing when I was with William, it was never about him. It was always about whoever was close to him, and so he was a rare and fine man. But I thank William that he knows how I am about the number nine, and that he lets this reading somehow mysteriously fall on the ninth day of October. For that, I'm grateful. So I am here with four or five readers. I'm here with Rick Bragg. Whose dog book about Speck is number 9 on the New York Times bestseller list. I'm here with Suzanne Kingsbury. God, I remember that book, The Gospel According to Gracie. And then I'm with Joe Taylor, who is a publisher of Fugitives of the Heart, the one book we're going to sort of focus on here today. And Michael White is in the room with us. He is the man who found these manuscripts, and so Michael will tell us all about that. At this point, we're missing Ron Rash, who promised to be here. If he doesn't show up, I'll read a paragraph from The Long Home. If he does show up, I don't know what he'll read, but we'll welcome him into the room. And without saying anything more,
I'm here. I'm here.
All right.
there he is.
Hey.
Thanks for being here, Ron Rash. Ron Rash is a poet and a novelist and our friend. So without saying too much more about these folks, we will just get her going with Rick Bragg.
There's not a lot to to say about William that other folks haven't already said and turned into myth. And the one thing that always bowled me over was how he could put a word against another word against another word and just kind of lean them all together so they don't all fall down. And I can't do his writing justice, and I will stumble all over it, and I apologize. But these are just the first few pages of this wonderful book. Yeats' father's sole claim to immortality was that he used to cause good car wrecks. On Allen's Creek, there's a steep curve overlooked by a red clay bank, and on the other side, a precipitous cliff attended by an illusory border of delicate alders. If you don't negotiate the curve, you go down through the alders to the tables of limestone. Who knows how far? Farther than you'd want to go. Yeats' father had a long blonde fright wig he'd come by somewhere, and a short red dress, and he used to paint his mouth gaudily with fire red lipstick, mascara his eyes, and whiten his cheeks with rice powder, and go sit atop the clay bank overlooking the road. Skirt hiked and awaiting the unwary, shaven legs spread, an ungodly sight, nightmarish, perhaps from hell, some displaced flapper from another time, another place. It is told by some old timers that he wore women's underwear when he did this, black, some say, or red. Others debate it, fact as well as color. A sense of humor is a sense of humor. but pulling on a pair of women's drawers is another thing altogether. His best day was early in the summer of 1941, when he sent a rattle-trap Plymouth loaded with drunks end over end to their doom. 3 were killed outright and 2 more died in the hospital. Afterwards, a survivor said, "That was either a man wearing a red dress or the ugliest white woman I have ever seen." Other than his sense of humor, he had no saving graces. He was a drunk and he was lazy. He was a drunk only when he could get whiskey, but he was lazy all the time. He had a job breaking ore in the mine, but a 50-pound sledgehammer grows ever so heavier when the morrow is as bleak as today. And ultimately, he turned to stealing, and that was his undoing. The boy was awakened in the winter's night by the creak of a wagon, the rattling of traces, iron wheels turning in frozen snow, the wind at the eaves tinkling the loose window panes in their sashes like chimes. He was instantly awake. Santa Claus, he thought. He was up, bare feet on the cold floor. He crossed silent to the nearest window. There was a wagon and a team of mules, their steaming breath pluming palely. There were voices. He went out. There was moonlight, a few ragged skiffs of snow, white against the black of the frozen night. It was very cold. "What is it?" his mother asked. There was an undercurrent of terror in her voice. She had an old overcoat clutched about her. "Fresh meat, by God," the man in the wagon said. His voice was muffled by effort. He leant and straightened and rolled over the sideboards a man's body that fell slackly and moved once when it struck the frozen earth, then no more. The woman knelt over it there on the frozen snow. Her breath made a kind of keening, whistling sound. The woman straightened and turned. Her face was ravaged and broken. The blood covering her hands and face looked black in the moonlight. She turned toward the boy, but she didn't seem to see him. She approached the wagon. "I told him 3 times it's just too many," the man said. "I aimed to fire over his head, but he's a pretty tall fellow and a little taller than I took him to be." From the high wagon seat, he looked as big as God. "I told it around. Whoever's been hitting my smokehouse would be toted off when I caught him. Well, here he is. I caught him." "You son of a bitch," the woman said. "You low-life son of a bitch." "It's hard times," the man said, "just stating a fact. And it takes hard people to get through them. I got mouths of my own to feed. You don't have to go to no law. I'm going to the high sheriff myself and tell him what I done. But I wouldn't expect much if I were you. Thieves was never thought much of in this part of the county." The boy felt this was not to be borne. "It ain't real," he thought. "None of it. I'm dreaming it. It ain't real because nobody could stand this. If it was real, I'd die in a heartbeat till I was deader than him. I'd disappear like some smoke and be just as gone. I can't stand this." The man snapped the lines and the wagon wheeled about in the dirty snow. Then he abruptly halted the mules. He picked up something else and rolled it over the sideboards. It looked like a side of meat. "I'm a fair man," the man said. His face was grizzled with thin gray whiskers. He turned his head to spit amber into the yard. "If he wanted it bad enough to trade his life for it, then it's his'n. I'm fair and you're welcome to it. I figure it's paid for. He turned to acknowledge the boy. Beneath the moonlight shadow of the slouch hat, his face appeared masked. A likely boy should learn something from this, he said. Thank y'all.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Rick. So it was a cold February morning in 2012, and I sat down at the computer and opened my email, and I had an email from a woman in Hole in Wall, and it said, "I loved him so much." I started making phone calls and called around and quickly learned William had died the night before of a massive heart attack. Well, a few days later, one of his kids got in touch with me and asked me if I'd like to come down and look at William's papers. And I said, sure enough. And the next day I showed up in Hole in Wall. And Chris and William Jr. had 2 big plastic tubs filled with notebooks. And I brought them home and looked at them, and there was over 50 notebooks with William's handwriting in them. William loved to write in little notebooks. Here's one of them. This is the notebook to Twilight. And he would write on every page of every notebook. And oftentimes he would put his coffee cup down on the page, and you'd end up with the coffee stain showing up on the page. So there were 50 notebooks there, and I started going through them. William's handwriting is quite a thing. He didn't dot his I's. He didn't cross his T's. His A's, E's, I's, and T's all looked the same. So it was a real job to decipher his handwriting, but I was able to figure it out after a little bit. And with the help of a crew of friends, we began to look and see. Of course, most of the material there was the things he'd been publishing in the last few years. But there was a bunch of unpublished material in there as well, and I began to sort it out. And as I was going back and forth to Hole in Wall at that time, the kids kept telling me I needed to go to the house where William had built and where he had raised the kids. And I was a little reluctant to go out there, but eventually I figured out where it was and went out there and talked to William's son-in-law, who was living in the house at the time, and he gave me access to the attic. And I had to go up these little steps that William had built and push these boards aside and poked my head up through the attic and stepped up into the attic. And the floor of the attic was covered with magazines. There was about 5 or 6 layers of magazines just laying there on the floor. And the air was filled with spider webs. I've never seen so many spider webs. Nobody had been in that attic for years except for the spiders. And the spider webs hung like gossamer in the air. It was like Spanish moss. And to get through, I had to reach out and clear the cobwebs out of the way. But on one wall of that attic was a long bookshelf, maybe 30 feet long, floor to ceiling, filled with all of William's books from the years from when he had built that house in the late 70s until he moved out in the late 80s or 90s. And as I went down that, I was fascinated by it, and I was kicking these magazines out of the way, and there were notebooks on the floor and among the magazines. And I was picking up the notebooks. And when I got to the end of the row of books, here was a little cardboard box sitting on one of the bookshelves. And when I opened that thing up, it was filled with typescripts. And there must have been 300 or 400 pages of typescript in that box. So I brought that thing home and started looking at it, and it was the typescript to 2 books. It was The Lost Country and Little Sister Death. But it was just like somebody had taken those 2 piles of typescripts and done like a pack of cards and put them all together and just mixed them up. And some pages had numbers on them and some didn't. And so it was a big jigsaw puzzle. And I laid those papers out all over the floor of my office here and began to sort them out. And sure enough, I was able to work it all together. And it turns out that, and the story's kind of well known, that William grew up in poverty, but he was a born writer from the time he was a kid on. And William wrote and wrote and wrote. And he started writing when he was 12 or 13 years old, and he had to make his own ink. And he made it out of walnut hulls that he would soak in water and make a brown stain and then write in a book. And he started writing in notebooks, and he did it all his life. And he would write from one end to the other, and then he would turn the notebook over and write back on the other side. And he wrote from 1962 is one of the earliest notebooks I have, up till the time he began to get published, but as is well known, William didn't get published until he was 59 years old. So in that attic were all of his writings from all those years. And William really came into his own as a writer by the time he was 30 years old. Didn't get published till he was 59. So there's this incredible archive of material that was there. And eventually I went back into the attic and dug around more and more. And against one wall of the attic were 2 sheets of sheetrock leaning against the wall. And eventually I went over and I pulled that sheetrock off, and behind it was a plastic milk jug tub, and it was filled with more notebooks. And there was another 20 notebooks in that tub. And I brought those home, and with the help of Team Gay, we began to type those up and look them over. And in that archive, we found 4 novels and a big collection of short stories. So there was all of William's writings from all those years. And that's what's been coming out ever since. And so we began and did 4 novels. Here they are. So far, we started off with Little Sister Death, which is William's ghost story. And then we did The Lost Country, which I think is really William's masterpiece. And then Stoneburner, which is a hard-boiled detective story, as only William could do it. And now we have Fugitives of the Heart, which is William's homage to Mark Twain and the Huck Finn story. And there is a collection of short stories that'll be coming out from Zank next year called This Ride's Not Over Yet. It's got some of the funniest things William ever wrote in there, particularly the ascension of Pepper Yates and how the story of how Pepper Yates got his name. And then there'll be another collection coming after that. So there was a massive amount of material there, and it's been an incredible job getting it all typed up and then sorting it out. And William was also a painter, and we can see an example of William's painting right here. This was the painting that hung over William's mantle. This was his favorite painting. And this is really an illustration from A Little Sister Death. Not many of his paintings illustrate the books, but some do. And there's a little ghost over in one corner of this painting, and it shows up on the side there. And this is something right out of the book Little Sister Death. So, but it was a real adventure getting to work with these notebooks and see them all. And I helped do some of the typing myself. And one night I was sitting there typing through a manuscript and came to this passage that was just on a separate page in the manuscript. And it said, I drove the dark highway with the radio tuned to a country music station. I felt myself drowning, inured in woes in a phantasmagoric landscape of lost love and betrayal. Until those folks became real to me, I was one with them. Ultimately, the night and the beer and the trusting black road and the music seemed to alter my very consciousness, making me a character in a single, unending epic song that came to seem not to be a song at all, but some folk story, whispered and told by a vast and infinitely crowded cast of folks who moved irrevocably towards infidelity with masochistic glee and a dread and near mythic inevitability. It was a West Texas night. The moon was tracking high above me, rendered the silver landscape cold and surreal. I stopped and cut the lights, the switch. Silence descended, and I got out into it. The desert looked timeless. Save the dark highway beseeching it, this could be the desert of 10,000 years ago, or of some vague and uncharted future. I turned. The truck looked anomalaic, 410. Above me, the dark bowl of the night sky was shot with pinholes of light. I urinated and lit a cigarette. The horizon where the highway and the sky met tugged me gently, as if bound to me by the webbing of some invisible wire, and I got out of the truck. I got into the truck and drove on. And that turned out to be the last paragraph of Stoneburner. And it's nowhere else it could have fit. It had to go right there, and it did. So William's writing is that kind of precious lyricism that illuminates our lives in a special way and brings us a special kind of beauty. And it's been a special privilege for me to be the finder of some of these manuscripts and to be able to work to bring them to light.
Well said. I'm just honored to be part of this celebration, and I will not tell a story because we don't. I want to have time to read, but I do want to say that one way William, I think, inspired all of us was he was, for me, the purest artist I've ever known. He didn't care about money or acclaim. He never bent a line to please anybody, but only to make it better. And I've been rereading him recently, and one thing that has struck me is that his world, the world that his characters move around in, is very dark, and it's only, it seems that the young in his novels and stories can only be protected by the very old, particularly the men, the lone survivors who know the world, know it's evil, yet at the same time have retained their decency. And one particular scene I love is near the ending of Long Home, where Weiner, the young man, has been threatened and will probably be killed, but William Tell Oliver, an old man in the community, has tried to prevent it from happening by setting a trap for Hardin, a bootlegger who is probably will eventually kill Weiner. No doubt. But this is the scene. This is between me and you. No, the truth is it ain't. At one time, it might have been, but you can't let well enough alone. You have to drag that boy into the same river of shit you swim in, Hardin. And when he won't, you hire him half killed. You can't even do it yourself. Well, you're right about one thing. Man wants something done, he has to do it himself. And that's why you see me here in the flesh. Oliver glowed the lamp and the room brightened perceptibly. He could feel the reassuring weight of the pistol dragging down his jumper pocket, and he shifted his balance and turned that side slightly away from Hardin toward the window. I reckon you get to do the talking, he said. You got all the high cards. Yes, I have, Hardin said, and I'm about to lay out my hand. I've been slacking off, easing up, giving all you cocksuckers too much rope. I worked to kill young Weiner instead of trying to teach him a lesson. But once a fool, always a fool. I'll put him where his daddy sleeps when I finish you here. He abruptly crossed the floor in 2 or 3 strides and hit Oliver savagely alongside the neck with his fist. The old man went sideways in crazy, teetering steps. Then his knees unhinged and he fell against the wall and slid down in it. Bitter, hot bile rose in his throat, and he thought for a moment he was going to vomit, but he fought it down. He had fallen on the gun and his hip hurt, but there was an exquisite pleasure to this pain. Hardin had approached and stood spraddle-legged over him. You all right? He asked with mock concern. I done something to my hip, the old man said thickly. I may have broke it. Likely you have, Hardin agreed. Old man's bones is brittle. I'll fix you up with Dr. Feelgood here directly. You won't feel a thing. Oliver shifted his position and rubbed his hip. He was wondering how good the light was, how drunk Hardin was, how sure he was of himself. He slid his hand into the jumper pocket. When it clasped the cold bone grip of the pistol, it was like shaking hands with an old friend. Help me up, he said. You don't need up. You wound up what string you had, and this is where you was played out. Help me up so I can lean against the wall. I don't want to die on my back like a snake you rocked to death. All right, Hardin said expansively. Even if you was a snake, I believe I about pulled your teeth. Tilted the rifle against the wall, and Oliver lifted his left hand toward Hardin, and Hardin grasped it. Oliver fired the first shot through the denim, and the concussion was enormous in the small room, showering them with splinters and flakes of flour paste and dead spiders. Even at this range, the shot was high and slammed into the loft, and he withdrew the piece and fired again. Hardin's face was slack with wonder. He'd thrown up a hand as if he might bat away the bullets with flesh and bone, and 2 fingers disappeared in a pink mist of blood and bone meal. He was still clasping Oliver's hand. When he finally hit Hardin in the chest, Hardin was abruptly jerked from his grip like some soul lost to floodwaters. "Oh, let me," he was saying when the 4th bullet struck him. Oliver never found out what he wanted. Hardin got up even with the dark hole charred in his face, and then he fell heavily back. That's just a wonderful moment, and one of so many in William's work. One thing that was really about a month after he died, I was rereading that book, The Long Home, and I wasn't as close to William as Sonny and some of you others. But I knew him, I think, pretty well. And that night I dreamed, and it wasn't even a dream, but just a moment. And I saw William, and he said, "It's all right."
I'm going to read read one big section and then a couple of paragraphs leading up to that section. This conversation is between Black Crow, an older black man, an ex-teacher, and as Ron said in this book also, an older man sort of takes in the young Yates. They're sitting on the doorstep of Yates's mother's house. Yates has become an orphan, and the house has been burned down. They're sitting there, and they hear wagon wheels coming. Yates speaks first. "There the son of a bitch comes," he said. Crow set his coffee cup carefully by his booted foot. He looked. "He's duty bound, all right," he said. "I left word everywhere for him. The post office, the Dow Cook store. I even told him at Mule Dick I ain't got nothing to say to him or him to me. You see what good it done. Here the son of a bitch comes." Crow shook his head in amused commiseration. "A man set on saving your soul ain't going to let a little thing like what you want get in his way." The Reverend Meacham is coming, and what he wants, he's learned that Yates is an orphan and he's homeless now. And what the Reverend wants to do is get Yates to live with the widow Peyton. She needs help on her farm, and he thinks that Yates will be the perfect fit. The widow Meacham is young, probably in her late 30s. She's attractive enough that she gathers a lot of gossip around the wood stove at Dow Cook's store. Springtime, Yates has lived the whole winter with the widow. She's read to him at night from Huckleberry Finn. She's even tried to convert him by taking him to a church. It was a church, speaking in tongues church, and Yates just loses it when an old man speaking in tongues tries to grab him. Yates runs out the door. He isn't having any of it. That spring, there were nights when the house simply would not contain him. The rich odors of the night would drift in. He'd be up and gone through window or door, whichever came first, not caring if she missed him or not. He'd just let the night take him. He wandered far into these nights, and he had no thought for sleep or need of it. Sleep was something other folks needed. He had transcended it without even meaning to. The fecund spring night sang in his blood like wine. Couched in the boughs of an enormous beech, he listened to the shanties fall silent, eavesdropping on the world at large, making it part of his life whether it wanted him or not, and watching the last of the yellow windows suck down to darkness and sleep, taking the ruined settlement as the last ones left burning were dictated by the rituals of sickness or death or courtship. Now, this is the actual scene. I really want, that was a little preparation for it. Yates is up in the attic, and you're going to find out why. It's in the widow Peyton's house. You're going to find out why he's up in the attic. With the awl, he worked the hole larger. Then Yates leaned to peer one-eyed through it. It was amazing, the view the hole afforded once you put your eye to it. He'd studied it from the underside of the bathroom ceiling, and it was scarcely noticeable. You had to know it was there. He laid the awl aside and looked again. He could see the entire top surface of the bathtub, a great expanse of white porcelain, the color of old ivory. He waited. It was warming up in the attic, and it was dark when he turned away from the lighted bathroom. He could smell old sun-cured wood and baking tin roof, hear the drone of dirt daubers plying their craft. The tin popped under the weight of the sun. Somewhere off toward the barn, there was the crowing of a cock. He waited with an air of impatience. Had he possessed a watch, he would have looked at it. When at length he heard her step in the hallway and the opening of the bathroom door, he fixed an eye to the hole again. He heard the bathroom door close and the bolt slide home, and he had a thought for how impotent that latch was. He still couldn't see anything save the tub. He heard the widow moving about in motions that sounded curiously furtive, and he heard the sound of a zipper and the soft whisper of fabric against fabric. He waited. A white, disembodied arm reached across the tub. It stoppered the tub. It turned the water on, waited to test how hot it was. It disappeared. He watched water run for a while. His knees began to ache. His interest quickened when a leg stepped into the tub. Then he could see the pale expanse of her back, smooth and slightly dusted with freckles. The shoulder blades rippled beneath the flesh. He scarcely breathed. Then she lay on back with her knees drawn up, and he could see her white, pooled breasts and mounded stomach and the thick thatch of red hair below it, and her long ivory thighs. Her eyes were closed. Slowly, she began to soap herself. He'd never noticed how long and tapering her fingers were. Soaped her breasts, her armpits, the length of her thighs. When her hand crept up to her inner thigh and hesitated where the flesh folded, it was all he could do to keep from crying out. He fumbled open his clothing and clasped himself. Of a sudden, there was a dry shriek of protesting nails being torn from wood, and the entire 4x8 section of ceiling board he was crouched on listed. The front dropped away from the joists and listed further, then plummeted floorward with Yates riding like some magic carpet Aladdin, some perverse fairy tale Aladdin, with jeans hobbled about his knees and mouth agape and wide eyes rolled wide in sheer unalloyed horror, and an enormous erection clasped before him both-handed like some weapon he'd do battle with. He slammed into the sink, and the sheetrock shattered, and his head slapped the wall so hard the room went electrically white. He was up immediately, trying to haul up his breeches and kick broken sheetrock out of his way. but she was up from the tub, up with an outraged, garbled shriek, all bobbing breasts and dripping pubic hair and ivory stomach, unmindful of her nakedness and flailing him about the head with whatever fell to hand, brushes, a bottle of shampoo, her fists. "You little beast!" she began to yell. "You filthy little beast!" She was staying between him and the door, but he went under a restraining arm and got a hand on the wood knob and tried to turn it. It wouldn't turn. While they fumbled for the thumb bolt and threw it, she was slamming him with a bar of soap. He went through the screen door at a dead run, with a tide of invective rising behind him, and the door slammed and rocked by its spring. By the time he reached the barn, he had adjusted his clothing, and calm had overtaken him. There appeared to be no pursuit, and he slowed his pace to one of dignified retreat. He crossed through the fence and went through a stand of sumac onto the red road. He looked back once at the house, and there was a look on his face akin to regret for all that was lost to him. Thanks.
This is so wild to hear the voice of William Gay on this beautiful October day. I was thinking about when we were on book tour together, and we were staying at sort of these beautiful, Jekyll Island and all these really beautiful places. And it was the last day, and William said, "Well, back to the trailer and the three-legged dog." He was I was thinking about, why is the grief still so available? Like when Michael picked up the handwriting in the coffee cup. And I think it's just, he was such an iconoclast. And in the literary world, he gave us some kind of, hope that like a writer can just rise, from a Tennessee holler and publish at 59. And he was such a genius, outside of academia or any other kind of schooling that we're told that we need so often. So I am reading a section of, actually it was a chapbook that McAdam and Cage published. That's an excerpt from the book we're reading from. It's interesting that it's set in 41, right? Because William's birthday is in about 2 weeks, and he was born in 41. Winter that year was short and mild. Then a false spring came in late February, and overnight the world softly altered. First the softwoods, then the oak and hickory budded and sprouted tiny leaves like archetypes of emerald grandeur. And the fruit trees bloomed in a riot of white and pink, and on Crying Woman Ridge, the wild plum trees from an abandoned orchard were banked like wind-blown snowdrifts. The new growth of leaves and mayapple softened the abrupt, harsh angularity of the ridges and gave the world the illusory quality of a mirage. Everything was blurred, green motion. Yeats took heart. Since the beating, he was much in the woods, avoiding any place that night might be, sleeping wherever night fell on him. And he welcomed this moderation of the temperature. He saw this early spring as a gift from the fates, a balancing of some cosmic scale. The scent of wildflower rode the winds, and he moved through the Edenic world with a newfound confidence. He began to think he might make it after all. Come March, and a hard freeze seized everything in ice, each blossom, each twig, each zygotic leaf. The muddy earth erupted in crystal spumes of ice, and he hugged himself against a bitter wind that had shifted northward. Glittering crystals of frost formed and drifted weightlessly earthward and vanished in the fire, and beyond the wall of heat, a circle of hoarfrost formed on the earth around him. He suspected some suspension of the natural laws, somebody asleep at the wheel, senility or madness overtaking whatever god controlled the weathers. He crouched, watching his house from the shelter of a windfall pine. Off and on for days he'd been watching the place, but his ribs still ached and he'd not approached it. Who knew where Knighton might turn up? He was rootless as smoke and might be anywhere. Knighton's truck was long gone, broken windshield and all, but Knighton himself might be hunkered in a darkened corner, cradling an axe like some beast of childhood nightmare. Yet there was no smoke from the chimney, no lights when night fell. He wondered where his mother was, his sister. He guessed his mother was laid up somewhere with Knighton, but he had no idea where Carmi might be. He had a thought for the chill of the night, for wayfarers on the road, for the cold, hard stones where she'd pillow her head. Dusk was drawing down the hollow like sleep, the known world telescoping inward. A chill wind carried a few tentative flakes of snow. He'd been living out here in the open until he felt barely human, just something resembling other folk, yet with some grim twists to mark it, some cautionary reminder of what can happen when your luck goes south. It was turning colder yet, and last night he dreamed of the living room stove and his bed. God damn, he said aloud. Somebody might as well be getting the use of it. He took up the club he'd taken to carrying and wound down the hillside toward the house. With its rusted roof and weathered dark planking, the house seemed a focus for drawing off such light as there was. The waning day sucked through failing window panes to the dark beneath the beds, the sooty corners of the closets. He entered and thumb-bolted the door behind him with some caution, but there was only the smell of dead ashes, cold, still air, a sort of humming silence. The first thing he looked for was the lamp, and he lit it and reglobed it and stood for a moment clasping the globe both-handed for the yellow kerosene heat. Then he turned his attention to the heating stove. It was packed almost full with wadded newspapers and grocery bags, and he found more and jammed them in along with a dress that didn't fit anyone and an ancient straw hat that had a combustible look about it. Then he paused and looked about the room to see had anyone left him a message saying where they'd gone. There was no note around. And if there was a message at all, it was in the spore of things and in silences. And there was nothing at all in any language he knew. Nothing save a wall calendar for some lost year where a trio of angels simpered in defiance of gravity from a hillock of cloud. He thought of Carmi and her own cindered wings, and despair hung in the corners of the room like smoke. He knelt and lit the newspapers and wandered into the kitchen in the off chance that they might have left any food. He hadn't had a warm meal and he didn't know how many days, and he envisioned a hot meal and an hour or two of basking before the fire. Then, maybe, he'd bar the door and hope Knighton was somewhere else for the night and take a chance on sleeping in his bed. He found an unlabeled can when opened, proved to be corned beef hash, and he raked it into a saucepan and carried it into the living room and set it atop the heater. Then he noticed the fire had gone out. "Why won't you burn, you cold son of a bitch?" he asked it. He found the kerosene can and hurled perhaps a quart of kerosene over the papers, and when he dropped a match in this time, it met his expectations. The papers exploded in billowing orange flames, and he was buffeted by an enormous wave of heat. He could hear the fire sucking up the chimney like a freight train. "That's more, by God, like it," he said. He was sitting crouched before the fire, eating cold corned beef hash with a spoon, when he heard a strange sound. He cocked his head sideways, listening. He'd had his ears attuned for Knighton's truck or a step on the porch, but this was a different sort of sound, a sort of hissing, keening that rose to a hoarse, croaking screech. He kept looking about the room, but the sound seemed sourceless, something out of the very ether. Yates was a believer in signs and portents, and he wondered, was this a warning of something dire? He had a spoonful of hash frozen between pan and mouth when an enormous flaming rat erupted the depths of the stove, scattering the fire coals of hell, garnered in the flames, and with paws outstretched like a flying squirrel riding the cusp of an explosion, it leapt upon him. "Ah!" Yates cried, wide-eyed and fallen backwards. He was trampled as the rat shot over him and went scrambling across the floor, its hot little footprints, the smell of burning oil and hair. On the braided rug, it left little seedlets of fire like vermin spreading a flaming plague. It fetched up against a wall and spun and came at him again like a demented wind-up toy. "Just throwing it everywhere," Yates cried. He'd come up with the broom and, like the participant in some bizarre game, was batting at the furiously animate rat. It had climbed up the window curtains now, and he knocked it free, but behind it left small hot flames like roses. The room was filling up with hot yellow smoke that bellied against the ceiling. The paper the room was sealing with began to curl and smolder. He looked wildly about. He ran into the kitchen for the water bucket, but there was no water, and he hurled the empty pail into the rising tide of fire. The rat lay still and smoking in the corner of the room. Yates began hopping about the room, stamping out little patches of fire, but others erupted and burning paper unreeled and drooped from the ceiling, and at last he took the saucepan and the spoon and he went out. It burned all night. He kept restoking it with the charred butt ends of rafters and floor joists. It was a long night. Daylight found him crouched over the coals, a soft snow falling. The saucepan set in hot ashes to reheat. He knew he should be on the move, but he didn't know where to, and he was loath to leave the fire. It was the first time he'd been warm in days. Thank you.
To Rick Bragg and to Joe Taylor and Ron Rash, Michael White, Suzanne Kingsbury. Suzanne, I will say that when you said something about that fine October when the conference was ending and he was heading back to Hohenwald, he joined me in this room. I don't know how you conjured him, but that really affected me deeply there in that moment. I, like everybody else, miss William. He and I rode up to Waterville, Maine, to Colby College to do a reading. He was the featured reader, and I was tagging along. But I drove us up there, and on the ride, I got to ask William about a certain paragraph in the long home where I said, William, and back then I was had presence of mind enough to quote the paragraph to William, and I said, how long did it take you to compose that paragraph? And he said, oh, however long it took to set it down. And I called bullshit on that. I said, no, writing doesn't come that way. It does for people. It really does. Rick and Ron, y'all know that, Suzanne. But, and then he told me he had photographic memory, that when he was hanging sheetrock, he really wasn't hanging sheetrock. And it was a miracle that he had his fingers and thumb, and that he hadn't cut them off with a sheetrock knife, a hawkbill knife that he liked to mention in his writing. He would compose whole paragraphs and pages in his head, and then go home at night and just simply transcribe what he'd already composed. I've always wanted to read this paragraph that I asked William about in the car. A Lincoln Continental that rode like a cloud somewhere up around New York City, where we got lost trying to go around it in the rain. But here's the paragraph, and then when I finish the paragraph, we'll finish the show here. And I love this one word sentence. Morning. A hot August sun was smoking up over a wavering tree line. Such drunks as were still about struggled up beneath the malign heat painfully, as if they moved in altered time or through an atmosphere thickening to amber. The glade was absolutely breezeless, and the threat of the sun imminent and horrific. The sweep of the sun lengthened. Window panes were lacquered with refracted fire. Sumac fronds hung wilted and benumbed as the whores and smell smocks rose bedewed from the foxglove and nightshade. Strange creatures, averse or unused to so maledictive a sun, they were all heir to a curious fragility, as if left to the depredations of the sun, their very flesh would sear and blacken, their limbs cringe and draw like those of scorched spiders. But the cool breath of the abyss drew them through the undergrowth like a magnet aligning iron filings on a glass slide. Hardin went down with his morning coffee, silent, unjocular. In fact, the glade seemed permeated with silence, an appalled hush in response to the night's bedlam, as if ultimately all things must balance. The air rising from the pit seemed to emanate from some reversal of the seasons at the earth's core. The undergrowth was more luxuriant here, darkening perceptibly toward the pit, the earth mounding in a fashion curiously vulval, the cleft in the rock, mysterious, enigmatic, as was William Gay. Thanks, folks, for helping to present William's work and the man here for the Southern Festival of Books in Nashville. Maybe next year it'll be live and in person. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sonny.
Thank you, Sonny.
Thanks, Sonny.
Yay.